Hello and welcome. Glad that you are watching, and I really do appreciate it because the reason that I record these is so someone will watch them, and if no one's watching, then there's no reason to keep doing this. But I'm very thankful that someone is watching, and hopefully you're getting something out of it. It is the day after Christmas as I film this, and very cold outside. I think the high today was 31, so I've got my hot chocolate here ready to go. Oh, that's good. And I'll be speaking to you about Philippians chapter 2 today. When someone comes home from a hard and stressful day at work, one way that we describe their exhaustion or their fatigue is to say that they're drained. And people can be drained physically, they can be drained emotionally, they can be drained mentally. And if one has worked hard digging ditches all day or loading or unloading trucks, one is physically drained. And if one has suffered from a virus like COVID or the flu, then certainly one is going to be drained. Some have jobs that are mentally draining. Accountants, educators, ministers, and scientists all have some mentally draining days. A student could be mentally drained by staying up all hours studying for an exam. Some have emotionally draining jobs, like healthcare workers, first responders, and social workers. Our work can sometimes drain us in all three ways that I mentioned, and if you have served as someone's caretaker or you've been dealing with a crisis, staying up all hours perhaps, or spending long hours dealing with that crisis, or if you are a parent who spends a majority of your days keeping up with preschoolers, then you are most definitely a person who gets drained. A soldier, an athlete, a mountain climber is certainly going to be drained at the completion of one of their tasks. To be drained is to feel that all the energy has gone out from you. You are beat. You are tired. You need rest. You can hardly take another step or think another thought. And the effort of one more decision just seems like too much. You just want to rest, maybe to sleep. And the Apostle Paul described how he was drained in Philippians 2:17. He mentions being poured out like a drink offering. To be poured out is to be drained. You have put your all into a project. You've emotionally, physically, and mentally invested yourself. And that is what Paul did in his ministry to both the lost and to the church. In his letter to the church at Philippi, he mentions being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith. He is speaking to a congregation of people. Paul has voluntarily poured himself out on their behalf. He has pushed himself to the limits for what is considered a worthy cause. And what could be a worthier cause than the spiritual development of people? It begins when their spirits are made alive to God through their faith in Jesus Christ, as they are reconciled to Him through Jesus. It's a spiritual awakening. It is a rebirth. And then to grow spiritually starts with knowledge of our Creator, learning what He desires of us so that we can live to His glory. And as the Philippians have partnered with Paul in sacrificing to advance the gospel, Paul has added to their sacrifice, pouring out himself in sacrifice to the same purpose. Paul mentions being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith. The word translated poured out is the common Greek word that refers to a drink offering, which most translations clearly indicate. The drink offering was a part of the daily offerings in Israel, the daily sacrifices as prescribed in Numbers chapters 15 and 28. Each morning and evening, a lamb was offered, along with a grain offering, and a bit of fermented drink was poured over the sacrifice. And the amount of wine used was a quarter of a hin. A hin is just slightly over a quart, and so it would be just the wine offering, the drink offering would be just over a quart, and the grain and drink offerings may have been included to symbolize that a meal consists of more than just one course, more than just meat. There are also vegetables and a drink. As in table fellowship with anyone else, when you are serving God, you don't just serve one course. There's also veggies and meat. We don't gyp God. Now, that's not to say that God needs our sacrifices to survive. He never did. But in making those sacrifices, people acknowledged his generosity by giving back not only from the herds and the flocks, but also from the vineyards and the fields and the vineyards and the fields and the orchards. And the drink offering was poured out by the priests as a supplement to the meat offering. In fact, it was poured out on top of the meat offering, and Paul's voluntarily pouring out of himself was supplemental to the Philippians' sacrifice and service. And so as a priesthood of believers, they were constantly sacrificing to the Lord. And the word for service in Philippians 2:17 is a word that commonly refers to priestly service in the temple. So there is some analogy here to Old Testament sacrifices, but in this case it's the Philippians who are the priesthood. Their sacrifice is their service to advance the gospel. And the drink offering supplementing this sacrifice is Paul himself, who is being poured out over their sacrifice. Paul will later say that he is poured out like a drink offering as he expects to be executed in 2 Timothy 4:6. In this case, however, it seems very unlikely that Paul is expecting to be executed. In this first imprisonment, Paul says in Philippians 2:24 that he fully expects to come back and visit the Philippians. And so in this case, he expects release, although he doesn't know for sure. He knows that there is the possibility of execution, but he fully expects that he's going to come back and see the church in Philippi. And so the pouring out in this case doesn't refer to his death, but to the sacrifice of the life he lives for the gospel. So what are these sacrifices offered by Paul and the Philippians for the advancement of the gospel? These sacrifices are the mutual hardship they suffer in order to live as disciples of Jesus. In Philippians 1:28, Paul urged the Philippians to not be frightened by those who oppose them. So obviously there were some people out there who didn't want the church to succeed. In 1:29 and 30, Paul assures the Philippians that they've been called to suffer for Christ, which puts them in the same struggle with Paul. Not only do they sacrifice by facing ostracism and humiliation at the hands of the gospel's enemies, but they voluntarily sacrifice of their means. And one way they do that is by giving to Paul's needs while he is in jail. Paul refers to their most recent gifts sent his way in Philippians 4:18 as fragrant offerings and an acceptable sacrifice pleasing to God. Paul's pouring out of himself for the sake of the gospel, both in the way he lived and in the way he'll later die, is an imitation of Christ pouring out himself for the gospel. The sacrifice Jesus made is described in verse 7 in terms of his emptying himself, his self-emptying. And the phrase translated made himself nothing in some translations, it literally means he emptied himself. Taking on the form of a slave, he was made in human likeness. Jesus emptied himself, not of his deity, but of many of his divine rights, at least temporarily. He denied himself, he emptied himself of his omniscience and his omnipresence as he came down to earth to experience some of the limitations that a human being lives. The self-emptying of Jesus is related by Paul as an example for his readers to follow. We empty ourselves by putting the needs of others first. As verses 3 and 4 have it, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. It's from here that Paul goes on to offer Jesus as the example of one who did that very thing. This means that we're to be poured out on behalf of others, and in the service of others, we will at times be drained, perhaps physically, mentally, emotionally. We physically serve the needs of others if we help someone move, if we cater to the sick, if we help someone with a repair job. There are a host of ways that we can help someone physically. We can emotionally serve others by just being for them, by celebrating with them when things are good, and by commiserating with them in times of sorrow. We mentally serve as we struggle to share the gospel in terms that someone might understand in hopes that they might be persuaded. The unity of the church is very important as we are to put others first. Disunity in Philippi had hindered some of Paul's Philippian readers in terms of love for each other and in providing a good example for outsiders. Bickering and infighting are usually caused, well, they're just about always caused by some selfishness on the part of at least one party. And there is far less fighting when Christians realize that deference to one's neighbor is usually the best policy. Most issues aren't worth fighting over. They're petty arguments about just wanting one's own way. And maybe someone doesn't like the class or the worship format. Maybe someone preferred another carpet color or different types of landscaping. Perhaps someone finds a neighbor to be distracting or annoying. And for most of these issues, the best thing to do most of the time is to do nothing. Just move past it. Now, if something is a sin problem, that's different. But don't be demanding. Don't be self-willed, because matters of preference are usually not worth fighting about. There were a couple of women in Philippi who are named in Philippians 4:2 who were in some kind of disagreement. Now, we don't know the extent of what this was about. We don't know the issue. But Paul pled with them to be of the same mind. In other words, to get along. And their dispute may have been a part of some larger issue in the church that led Paul to write in 2:14 and 2:14. He said, "Do everything without complaining or arguing." Now, everything, that covers a lot of ground. The results of doing everything without complaining and arguing are found in verses 15 and 16, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. Being a peaceable people in a peaceful church enhances a good reputation. You know, the politicians are always trying to dig up dirt on their opponents. Well, let's make sure that if we were investigated, background checked, or even spied upon, that there would be no dirt to be had. Now, we cannot do anything about a pre-Christian past, but we can live blameless and pure lives from this point forward. We can do it. And that will make it all the more obvious that we are children of God, that we bear the family resemblance of holiness and righteousness. Children are often imitators of their parents, sometimes without even trying. And may we always be imitators of God. May that become second nature to us. And then we will certainly stand out from the rest of this sinful world where there is constant backbiting and competition and gutter talk. If we don't engage in those things, then we're going to stand out. In fact, we'll shine like stars in the sky. Stars provide light, and light eliminates ignorance. It provides direction. Travelers have navigated their journeys by the stars. May we be unmovable stars by which others can navigate their lives. May our example be that impressive. And we're to do all this while, according to Paul in verse 16, we hold firmly to the word of life. If we begin to neglect the word, we will not have the edification that we need to see this through. But if the Philippians could manage to do this and keep it up, then Paul would be able to boast on the day of Christ that he neither ran nor labored in vain. He compares his work among the Philippians to a foot race or to labor. Ministry is an endurance run. It takes discipline and conditioning. To quit halfway through is to have run in vain. To quit a project in the middle and never come back to it is to have labored in vain. Now, there may be times you're forced to quit something, but that's not what we're talking about here. Do your best to finish well, and you will be truly successful. But Paul never gave up in this regard. He did not give up on people. Now, sometimes people would give up on or reject the faith, and Paul moved on. But as long as folks were willing to keep clinging to the word, Paul would keep holding on to them. It takes great patience to keep pouring yourself out for the spiritual development of others. But it's a part of what we are called to do as Christians. As the Philippians were partners with Paul in the gospel, they were partners in his ministry and in some of his sufferings. But while Paul was pouring himself out for the gospel, he had no regrets. He did not resent the situation. Putting the needs of others first had landed Paul in a jail cell. But in Philippians 2:17 and 18, He says, "But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you, so you too should be glad and rejoice with me." Paul experiences gladness even in the midst of suffering because, as he said back in Philippians 1:12, what had happened to him had served to advance the gospel. He goes on in verse 13 of that chapter, noting that it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Not only had the palace guard learned of the cause for which Paul was in chains, but some of them had now been converted to that cause. In 4:22, Paul sends greetings from members of Caesar's household who had become disciples. Now, the term household here doesn't necessarily mean Caesar's own family, but the term household would include all who were in the employ of Caesar, including guards and soldiers. Nor did this reference to Caesar's household necessarily mean that Paul was in Rome at the time of this writing, but this may have been during his earlier imprisonment in Caesarea before he was sent to Rome after having appealed to Caesar. That could explain why he expects to be released. We really don't know, but we do know that at least some in Caesar's employ have been converted by Paul. And if some of these people were jailers, Paul would never have met them had he not been incarcerated. So he rejoices, despite having been poured out or being poured out like a drink offering. And he urges the Philippians to rejoice along with him. Not only are they to share in his sacrificial living for Christ and in his suffering, not only are they to share in working and giving to advance the gospel, but they are also to share in Paul's joy. Joy is not dependent on circumstances, nor is my relationship to Christ dependent upon circumstances, but true joy is knowing Christ and having a part in the furtherance of the gospel. If that is our reason for living, we've always got a reason to get up in the morning. We can know that God is using us for his purposes in ways we don't even realize. God providentially intervenes in our lives for the furtherance of the gospel, and we can rejoice knowing that if we pray, God will use us. Up until this point in the letter to the Philippians, Paul has often spoken of his own joy. In 1:4 and 5, he prayed that the Philippians, or rather he prayed with joy that the Philippians were his partners in the gospel. In 1:18, he rejoices that Christ is preached even by those with less than the purest of motives. But now Paul urges the Philippians to share in his joy. He says, "I am glad and rejoice with all of you, so you too should be glad and rejoice with me." In 3:1, he tells his readers to rejoice in the Lord. In 4:1, he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice." True joy is not a matter of pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. True joy is not a matter of pretending that it doesn't hurt when it does. But joy is an inner tranquility, a type of satisfaction, contentment that God has used us as we are surrendering to him, and he will continue to do so. And there is hardly a greater joy than that of knowing that you have poured yourself out for someone else. Paul poured himself out in the sacrifice of his time, his labor, and his freedom. He suffered at the hands of opponents many times. When he initially came to Philippi, he was thrown into jail along with Silas, and they were beaten for having challenged paganism. When is the last time that you have poured yourself out on behalf of another? You made the efforts to teach them the gospel. You served them when they were sick, or maybe you gave generously to help someone or several someones, or you encouraged someone with kind words of affirmation, and it really wasn't that hard. Or if you spent some time just being with someone, just communicating to them that they are valued. Pour yourself out for someone this coming week. Paul was poured out for the spiritual development, not only of the people of his time, but people down through the ages, including us. And in this, he followed the way of Jesus. Yes, Jesus had emptied himself. And as with Paul, you could say that he poured himself out for us. But in the case with Jesus, his outpouring was the outpouring of his very blood, his very life's blood, poured out for us. Jesus allowed his life's blood to be poured out on our behalf, and we will never go farther than Jesus did in service to another. So in light of what he did for you, what will you do for him? Will you live for him? Will you sacrifice for the spiritual development of others? Will you be poured out as a sacrifice to the benefit of humankind? If you need to commit or recommit to Jesus Christ, I urge you to do so.